It is the night of September 11, 1683. The ruins of a small church sit on top of a hill called the Kahlenberg, overlooking a vast valley. The roof is gone, the walls are scarred by fire, but there is a makeshift altar inside, and at that altar stands a Capuchin friar named Marco d'Aviano, sent here by the Pope himself. And kneeling beside him, serving at the altar like a common acolyte, is the King of Poland, Jan Sobieski. Warrior, statesman, the Lion of Lechistan, is on his knees in the rubble, holding a candle, assisting at the Mass. Around him, 70,000 men are praying. Germans, Austrians, Poles, Bavarians, Saxons, men who do not speak the same language, who do not trust each other's kings, who in many cases have been at war with each other within living memory. But tonight they are praying together, because tomorrow they are going to try to save Vienna. And far below them, spread across the plain like a second city made of canvas and silk, the Ottoman camp glows in the darkness. Tens of thousands of campfires, the greatest military encampment in European history. And beyond that, Vienna itself, burning, breached, days from falling. We have spent 2 episodes getting here. We watched Kara Mustafa march an empire's army westward, chasing a dream the Ottomans called the Red Apple, the golden dome of a conquered Christian capital. We watched Starhemberg and his garrison hold those walls with their fingernails, fighting in the tunnels beneath the city, sending up desperate signal rockets, 5 points of light pleading for help. Help is here now. It is standing on the hilltop, and it is about to come down. But before we get to the battle, we need to understand how this army came to exist at all. Because 70,000 men from a dozen different states do not just appear on a hilltop. Someone has to build that coalition, fund it, hold it together. And the man most responsible for that, more than any king, more than any general, was an elderly Italian sitting in Rome, Pope Innocent XI, the war's architect. When Vienna was besieged on July 14, Emperor Leopold had already fled the city a week earlier. He went to Passau, then Linz, and from there he launched a frantic letter-writing campaign to every Christian monarch in Europe. He begged, he pleaded, he called in every favor, invoked every treaty, appealed to every obligation. And Louis XIV of France, the most powerful king in Christendom, said no. Flat out no. France had a long-standing alliance with the Ottoman Empire. Louis wanted the Habsburgs weakened. He was offered a Christian state at Constantinople to be ruled by his own son, and he turned it down. That is how deep the cynicism ran. The Sun King watched the Ottomans threaten to swallow Central Europe and calculated that it served his interests. Realpolitik at its most naked. So the Pope stepped in. Innocent XI opened the papal treasury on a scale rarely seen. 300,000 florins annually to the emperor, 200,000 imperial thalers to Poland, over 1.5 million florins to Poland alone within a single year. He brokered the Treaty of Warsaw, personally overcoming the deep mutual suspicion between the Habsburgs and the Poles. He pressured German princes to contribute troops, and this was the masterstroke. He framed the entire campaign as a holy war for Christendom, not a Habsburg dynastic squabble, a civilizational struggle. Without that framing, the German princes and the Polish parliament could have refused to send troops beyond their borders. With it, refusal became almost impossible. The Pope had given them no room to say no. The coalition that assembled was remarkable. 20,000 Austrians under the Duke of Lorraine, 11,000 Bavarians, 9,000 Saxons, 8,000 Franconians and Swabians, and the force everyone was waiting for, 18,000 Poles, mostly cavalry, under their king. Overall command went to Sobieski. He held the highest rank among them, a reigning king. But who was this king, and why did he come? Jan Sobieski was not what you might expect from a 17th century Polish king. Born in 1629 to high nobility, educated at the Jagiellonian University, widely traveled. He had been to France, England, the Netherlands. He was a patron of poets and painters. He was also, and this is crucial, a man who had once been a voluntary hostage at the Crimean Tatar capital. During that time, and during diplomatic missions to the Ottoman Empire, he learned both Tatar and Turkish. He studied Ottoman military traditions and tactics firsthand. He understood his enemy in ways no other European commander could. His military career reads like a catalogue of improbable victories. At Podhaice in 1667, he turned back Tatar forces outnumbering his own 10-1, with an army he had funded from his own pocket. At Khotin in 1673, he annihilated an entire Ottoman army on the Dniester River. That victory was so decisive, it put him on the throne. The Polish nobility elected him king the following year. 10-1 odds, his own money. That is not a general following orders. That is a man who fights because something in him will not let him stop. But the thing that makes Sobieski genuinely interesting, the thing that lifts him out of the parade of armor-clad warrior kings, is his letters. His correspondence with his wife, Marie Casimir, is one of the great love letter collections of the 17th century. He wrote to her constantly, even from campaign. Tender, funny, detailed letters. The kind of letters that make you realize there was a complete human being inside that polished cuirass. The Polish Biographical Dictionary describes him as an individual above his contemporaries, but still one of them, an oligarch and magnate, interested in personal wealth and power. That is an honest assessment. Sobieski was not a saint. He was ambitious, and much of that ambition was instilled by Maryshenka, whom he loved more than any throne. But his faith was also genuine, and that combination, the ambition and the conviction, the love letters and the lances, is what makes him more than a cardboard hero. So why did he come to Vienna? Treaty obligation, partly. The Treaty of Warsaw bound him legally, and breaking it would have destroyed Poland's diplomatic credibility. Strategic calculation. If Vienna fell, Poland was next, and better to fight the Ottomans at someone else's walls than at your own. Religious conviction. He was a devout Catholic who genuinely saw the Ottoman advance as a civilizational threat. Personal glory. Khotin had made him a king. Vienna could make him a legend, and frankly, the promise of plunder. The Ottoman camp was known to be fabulously wealthy. He departed Warsaw on August 15th with his army, leaving Poland essentially undefended. He warned the Hungarian prince Imre Tokoli that destruction would await him if he tried to take advantage. His young son Jakub rode beside him. They marched 435 miles southwest toward Vienna. The coalition forces converged at Tulln on the Danube, northwest of Vienna, in early September. This was where Sobieski met the Duke of Lorraine and the German commanders for the first time. The plan, Lorraine's plan, was elegant on paper. March through the Vienna Woods to the Kahlenberg Heights, then assault the Ottoman forces from above, squeezing them against three obstacles: Vienna itself, the Danube, and the Vienna River. The problem was the Vienna Woods. 30 miles long, 20 miles wide, a vast expanse of thickly forested foothills, steep terrain, gullies, streambeds. The roads were little more than forest tracks, and they had to get 70,000 men through it, plus thousands of cavalry horses, lumbering artillery pieces, baggage trains. Sobieski was furious when he saw the actual terrain. The map sent to him by the imperial commanders had misled him. He had expected far more level ground. He proposed a detour, a slower advance, but time was running out. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg's garrison was dying. The guns were the worst of it, dragging artillery over steep slopes cut with ravines. Every piece had to be muscled up and over by hand and horse, inch by agonizing inch. The march that should have taken a day took several. The entire campaign hung on whether they could get through those woods in time. And they did, barely. On September 11th, the army reached the Kahlenberg Ridge and looked down at the plain below. What they saw must have been staggering. An Ottoman camp so vast it looked like a city, a canvas metropolis of tents and pavilions stretching to the horizon, smoke rising from the walls of Vienna. The scale of it, the sheer impossible scale. Polish soldiers who had fought Tatars on the Ukrainian steppe, who thought they had seen large armies, stood on that ridge and stared. Inside the city, only 4,000 of Starhemberg's original 15,000 defenders were still fit to fight. After 2 months and 18 major assaults, munitions were nearly exhausted. The walls were breached in multiple places. Starhemberg had sent up signal rockets from St. Stephen's Cathedral. 5 points of light, the same signal we talked about in episode 2, the desperate plea that had gone unanswered for so long. Those rockets had been answered at last. And here is an irony worth noting. The Ottomans saw those same rockets and misread them. They thought the light signaled that the city was about to fall. In premature celebration, Ottoman troops broke into suburban Viennese wine cellars and went on a drinking binge. While the relief army prayed on the hilltop, part of the besieging army was getting drunk on stolen wine. That is the kind of detail history gives you sometimes. You cannot make it up. Now, here is where the story turns, because everything that follows, the battle, the charge, the rout, the silk cord, flows from a single decision made by one man. Kara Mustafa knew the relief army was coming. Reports had been filtering into his camp for days, but the scale and speed of the coalition appears to have surprised him, and the Crimean Tatars, positioned to screen the approaches and provide early warning, displayed what historians call an almost embarrassing lack of zeal. They did not attack the relief force as it crossed the Danube. They did not harass it through the Vienna Woods. They let 70,000 men reach the Kahlenberg Heights essentially unmolested. Why? Historians debate it. Some argue the Khan was personally hostile to Kara Mustafa. Others suggest the Tatars simply judged the situation hopeless and were preserving their forces for the retreat they saw coming. Either way, it was catastrophic. So when it became clear the relief army was deploying above him, Kara Mustafa had options. He could have abandoned the siege and consolidated his forces for a head-on battle. He could have fortified the Kahlenberg Hills before the Christians crossed them. He could have attacked the relief army piecemeal as it struggled through that difficult terrain. He chose none of these. Instead, he split his forces. 15,000 of his best troops, Janissaries, the elite infantry that had been the backbone of Ottoman military power for centuries, stayed in the siege trenches, continuing to assault a city that, in the grand scheme of what was about to happen, no longer mattered. Another 63,000 or so faced the relief army. 18,000 Tatars held the left wing near Maria Brunn, where they would contribute almost nothing. The historian Ludwig Dick puts it bluntly. Their victory was not so much due to any Christian brilliance as it was to Mustafa's negligence and arrogance. His own general, Ibrahim Pasha, opposed the decision. It was the choice of a man who could not psychologically accept that his grand gamble had failed. The red apple, the dream we talked about in episode 1, was dying, and he refused to see it. Dawn, September 12, 1683. The Allied battle plan was an echelon attack from left to right. Charles of Lorraine and his Austrians and Saxons would engage first on the northern end, drawing Ottoman forces toward them. The center, Bavarians, Franconians, Swabians, would advance next, and Sobieski, with his Poles on the right wing, held back on the higher ground, would wait. He was the killing blow, but the killing blow had to be timed perfectly. At 6 in the morning, Lorraine's infantry began descending the northern slopes. The fighting for the fortified villages of Nussdorf and Heiligenstadt was immediate and fierce. Ottoman resistance was determined. Multiple counterattacks were repulsed. By mid-morning, the center was engaged. Waldeck's Franconians and Max Emanuel's Bavarians pushed through difficult terrain against Ibrahim Pasha's 23,000 defenders. Cavalry, militia, and Janissary infantry dug into fortified ridges. For 12 hours, infantry fought a brutal slogging match across vineyards and hillsides and streambed gullies. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. The battle genuinely hung in the balance. Ottoman forces fought hard. The terrain favored defense. At noon, at 1 o'clock, at 2, nobody watching could have told you which side would win. This matters. It is easy, knowing how the story ends, to treat the infantry battle as a prelude, the boring part before the cavalry arrives. It was not. It was the foundation. Without those 12 hours of grinding, exhausting, unglamorous work by Austrian, Saxon, Bavarian, and Franconian soldiers, the cavalry charge would have been a suicide mission. You do not send 18,000 horsemen into an army that still has reserves and uncommitted units. You send them into an army that is pinned, stretched, and exhausted. The infantry made that possible. They bought the charge with their blood. Polish historiography celebrates Sobieski's decisive stroke. Austrian and German historiography celebrates Lorraine's battle plan and the infantry's 12-hour sacrifice. Both are right. The battle required both components, the patience and the thunder. By 3 in the afternoon, Sobieski's Polish infantry began descending on the right. The king himself surveyed the battlefield from the heights, waiting, watching. At 5 o'clock, after nearly 12 hours, he judged the moment had come. The Ottoman infantry was fully engaged across the entire line. Their reserves were committed. The Ottoman flank was exposed. He gave the order. I want you to understand what is about to happen. Not as a line in a textbook, not as a date to memorize, as a physical event experienced by human beings who were standing on that ground. 4 divisions of cavalry, 3 Polish, 1 Imperial Austrian, began forming on the slopes of the Kahlenberg. 18,000 horsemen, among them, at the very tip of the spear, 3,000 Polish Winged Hussars, the Hussaria, the most feared cavalry in Europe for over a century. Every rider a minor nobleman who equipped himself. These were wealthy men who had invested everything in their arms, their armor, their horses. Full cuirass polished to a mirror finish, gold ornamentation glinting in the late afternoon sun. Each man carried a lance over 16 feet long, made of light pine, hollow in sections, tipped with a steel point and a small pennant. The lance was designed to shatter on impact, a one-use weapon that delivered devastating kinetic energy. And the wings. Large wooden frames, curved, attached to the saddle or backplate, fitted with eagle feathers. They rose above and behind each rider, creating a silhouette that was not entirely human. The purpose is still debated. Psychological terror, certainly. The wings made the riders look larger, monstrous, otherworldly, but they also did something else. During a charge, wind rushing through the feathers produced a sound, a humming, a whistling, a buzzing that rose and merged with the thunder of hooves into something no one who heard it ever forgot. At 6 o'clock the signal was given. Cannons roared, musket volleys cracked across the line, seeding confusion in the Ottoman ranks. And then Sobieski, a king, 54 years old, armored head to foot, at the head of 3,000 heavy lancers, bellowed across the hillside, "Let my hussars break those ranks!" They came down the Kahlenberg like an avalanche. 18,000 horses at full gallop. The vibration was physical, something you felt in your ribcage before you heard it. The earth shook. Dust rose in clouds behind them. Lances lowered to the charge position, a forest of steel points 16 feet ahead of the riders, converging on the Ottoman lines. And above it all, that sound, the wind tearing through thousands of feathered wings, rising from a hum to a howl, mixing with the drumming of hooves and the war cries of Polish and German and Austrian cavalrymen, until it became a single wall of noise that swallowed everything. This was the largest cavalry charge in recorded history. 18,000 horsemen descending a hillside into an army that had been fighting for 12 straight hours. The late afternoon sun at their backs, turning their polished armor into a wall of blinding light. Think about what that looked like from below. You are an Ottoman soldier. You have been fighting since dawn. You are exhausted. And from the hillside above you, something is coming down. A wall of steel and feathers, glittering, screaming, the ground shaking beneath your feet. The lances, longer than any pike you have ever seen, leveled directly at you, the shapes behind them not quite human. The charge lasted approximately 30 minutes. In 30 minutes, the entire Ottoman position collapsed. The cavalry punched through the Ottoman lines and drove straight into the heart of Kara Mustafa's camp. The impact rippled outward like a shockwave. Soldiers who had been fighting all day threw down their weapons and ran. Panic spread from the point of contact through the entire army. The camp, with its thousands of tents, its treasuries, its baggage trains, its livestock, was abandoned in minutes. After 12 hours of a battle that could have gone either way, it was over in half an hour. 12 hours of infantry slogging and 30 minutes of cavalry to end it. The ratio tells you something about how war works. The patient, unglamorous labor creates the conditions. The decisive moment exploits them. But without those 12 hours, the 30 minutes would have been a massacre in the other direction. The defeated Ottomans would later give Sobieski a title of their own, the Lion of Lekistan, Lechistan, their name for Poland. Even in defeat, they recognized what they had faced. The Ottoman army dissolved. That is the only word for it. Dissolved. An army that had besieged Vienna for 2 months, that had fought stubbornly all day, simply ceased to exist as a fighting force in the space of an evening. Kara Mustafa fled east. He managed to take one thing with him, the standard of the Prophet, the holy banner. Losing that would have been an even greater shame than what had already happened. He grabbed the banner and ran. From inside the city, Starhemberg, the man who had sworn to defend Vienna to the last drop of blood, and very nearly had, rallied his exhausted garrison and sallied out through the Schottentor gate to join the pursuit. The defenders had held. The walls had held. Just barely. Just long enough. By 9 o'clock that night, the battle was effectively over, and the Allied soldiers walked into the Ottoman camp. What they found was almost beyond description. The camp was a canvas city, one of the largest military encampments ever assembled, and it had been abandoned virtually intact. Thousands of tents, mountains of provisions, weapons, ammunition, livestock, cattle, sheep, camels, gold, silver, precious fabrics. Kara Mustafa's personal tent compound was more like a palace complex. It had baths, a garden, fountains. Sobieski entered the vizier's tent on the night of September 13 and sat down to write a letter to his wife. And this letter? This is where Sobieski stops being a bronze statue on a horse and becomes a person. Listen to what he writes to Marisienka. "The only solace of my heart and soul, the loveliest and most beloved Marisienko, God our Lord blessed for eternity, has granted a victory and glory to our nation, the like of which was never heard of in centuries past. Ours are treasures unheard of, tents, sheep, cattle, and no small number of camels. It is a victory as nobody ever knew before. The enemy now completely ruined, everything lost for them. All the cannons, all the camp, uncounted riches have fallen into our hands. And then this, and you can hear him almost laughing as he writes it. He had baths, he had a little garden and fountains, rabbits, cats. There was even a parrot, but it was flying around and we could not catch it. A parrot. In the middle of the greatest military victory of the century, the King of Poland is telling his wife about a parrot he could not catch. What bad luck that in one of the imperial palaces the vizier took a strangely beautiful live ostrich. But this too he ordered beheaded so that it would not fall into our hands. Kara Mustafa had an ostrich beheaded rather than let the Christians have it. There is something so petty and so human about that. The Grand Vizier's empire collapsing around him, and he stops to have his ostrich killed out of spite. And then there were the sacks. Among the plunder, soldiers found hundreds of sacks filled with strange brown beans. They thought it was camel feed. They were going to burn them. But according to legend, a Polish soldier and diplomat named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, a man who had lived in the Ottoman world, who knew Turkish culture, recognized the beans for what they were: coffee. When offered his choice of the plunder, he supposedly asked for nothing but the coffee sacks. He is credited with opening Vienna's first coffee house, the Blue Bottle Inn. The story is probably embellished. Historians now think the first Viennese cafe was actually opened by an Armenian tradesman 2 years later. But the legend persists that the Viennese coffeehouse tradition, one of the great cultural institutions of Europe, was born in the wreckage of the Ottoman camp. Since 2011, Viennese coffeehouse culture is UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage. Its origin story is a battlefield. And then the line that stuck, the one that echoed through the courts of Europe. Sobieski, summing up the greatest military humiliation in Ottoman history in a single sentence: the vizier took everything with him, except his honor. After the victory, Sobieski sent a letter to Pope Innocent XI, and in that letter he included 3 Latin words that have echoed down 4 centuries: Venimus, Vidimus, Deus, Vicit. We came, we saw, God conquered. A deliberate paraphrase of Caesar's Veni, Vidi, Vici, but with a crucial change. Caesar claimed the victory for himself. Sobieski gave it to God. This was both genuine piety and brilliant politics. By crediting the Almighty, Sobieski showed the modesty of a true Christian king while simultaneously handing the Pope the ability to claim the victory for the Church. Along with the letter, he sent the captured standard of the Grand Vizier to Rome. The political aftermath, though, was not all unity and gratitude. Leopold, the emperor who had fled Vienna and organized the coalition from a safe distance, was furious. He had expected to ride triumphantly into the liberated city. Sobieski got there first. The cold reception Leopold gave the Polish king poisoned Habsburg-Polish relations for years. The man who saved Vienna was thanked with a handshake and a grudge. Sobieski's own Polish troops had their own grievance. The German soldiers had reached parts of the camp first and claimed much of the best plunder. The savior of Christendom went home to a kingdom that was poorer and more exposed than when he left it. Glory, it turns out, does not pay the bills. Now let me tell you about the silk cord. After the rout at Vienna, Kara Mustafa tried to hold the remnants of his army together as he retreated east through Hungary. It was futile. The army was disintegrating. Desertion was constant. And Kara Mustafa, in the way of desperate men who cannot face their own failure, began looking for someone else to blame. He started executing his subordinate commanders, one by one, men who might tell the Sultan what had really happened, men who might describe the decisions, his decisions, that led to the catastrophe. He was trying to silence the witnesses. It did not work. Sultan Mehmed IV, the same sultan who had sat in Belgrade hunting while Kara Mustafa marched on Vienna, the same sultan whose preference for falconry over governance had given the Grand Vizier unchecked power in the first place, now succumbed to pressure from the vizier's enemies at court. The Ottoman historian Siladar, who had been there at Vienna, who had seen the whole thing, described it flatly: the most disastrous defeat since the foundation of Ottoman statehood in 1299. Someone had to pay for that. The Sultan issued his order. December 25, 1683, Christmas Day, Belgrade. The same Belgrade where the Sultan had waited and hunted while the army marched west. The symmetry is almost too perfect. The Sultan's emissaries arrived at the place where Kara Mustafa was staying. They carried the instruments of execution. In the Ottoman Empire, strangulation with a silk cord was the prescribed method for high-ranking persons. It was considered more dignified than beheading. The body remained whole. The executioners were typically the bostanci, the imperial gardeners who doubled as executioners. There is something in that detail that feels like it belongs in a novel, but it is simply how the Ottoman system worked. When they told Kara Mustafa what was coming, the sources say he asked a question, quietly, "Am I to die?" And then, after a moment, "As God pleases." They strangled him with the silk cord. They severed his head and placed it in a velvet bag. The bag was carried from Belgrade to the Sultan at Edirne, where the head was displayed on the warning stone, a traditional display point for executed officials, a literal stone of warning. The man who had dreamed of the red apple, who had overridden his sultan's orders and his general's advice to chase a vision of a Western Muslim empire, who had left his best troops in the trenches and his flanks unguarded and his pride intact until the very end. His head ended up on a stone. There's something in Kara Mustafa's story that goes beyond military history. He rose through the Ottoman system by ambition and cunning. He gambled everything on Vienna, and the same system that elevated him destroyed him. The silk cord was the empire's way of saying, "We made you, and we can unmake you." Remember the guns we talked about in the first episode? The heavy siege artillery Kara Mustafa left behind because he was so confident he would not need them. That was the original sin. Everything flows from there, from a man so certain of his own destiny that he could not conceive of failure. Vienna was not the end. It was the beginning of the end. The victory galvanized Christian Europe. In 1684, the Pope formally constituted the Holy League, the Empire, Poland, and Venice, with Russia joining 2 years later. The war continued for 16 more years. In 1686, Buda, the capital of Ottoman Hungary, was recaptured. In 1687, the Ottomans suffered another catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Mohacs, the same field where they had crushed Hungary in 1526. The same field. 161 years later, the symmetry was not lost on contemporaries. That same year, 1687, Sultan Mehmed IV was deposed by his own janissaries. The man who had hunted while his empire burned was removed by the very soldiers he had sent to die. The war ended in 1699 with the Treaty of Karlowitz. And this treaty, this is the one that matters. Because the Treaty of Karlowitz was the first time in 350 years of Ottoman history that the empire was forced to cede substantial territory. For 3.5 centuries, from 1299 to 1683, the trajectory had been exclusively one of expansion. The Ottoman tide advanced. Always. It took territory. It absorbed kingdoms. It swallowed nations. After 1683, it never advanced again. Austria received most of Hungary, Slavonia, and Transylvania, 60,000 square miles. Venice received Dalmatia and the Peloponnese. Poland received parts of modern Ukraine. The Ottomans, for the first time, were dictated to. Previously, they had set the terms. Now they accepted them. September 12, 1683, is the geographic and strategic high watermark of Ottoman power in Europe. That is not a metaphor, it is a fact. After that day, the tide flowed only one way, backward. The Ottoman Empire would never again threaten the heart of Europe. It would spend the next 240 years slowly losing territory, influence, and power, becoming, by the 19th century, what diplomats called the sick man of Europe, and finally dissolving entirely in 1922. And for the Winged Hussars themselves, the warriors who broke the Ottoman line, Vienna was their last great moment. The age of heavy cavalry was ending. Disciplined musket-armed infantry and artillery were making the mounted charge obsolete. Within a generation, the hussars would be an anachronism. Vienna was their swan song, and what a song it was. All of that, the decline of an empire, the end of an era of cavalry warfare, the reshaping of the European balance of power, traces back, in one way or another, to an afternoon on the Kahlenberg when 18,000 horsemen came down a hill. We have covered a lot of ground in these 3 episodes. The march west, the siege, the tunnels and the countermines, the signal rockets, the charge. But I keep coming back to the people. Starhemberg, who held those walls with 4,000 exhausted men and swore he would die before he surrendered. He did not die, but he came close enough to taste it. Sobieski, who rode 435 miles to fight another king's war and led the charge himself at 54 years old, then sat in the vizier's tent writing his wife about a parrot he could not catch. He would spend the last 13 years of his life in decline, never again matching the heights of that September afternoon. The man who saved Christendom died in 1696, largely forgotten by the allies he had rescued. Kara Mustafa, who chased the red apple all the way to the walls of Vienna and found a silk cord waiting for him at the end. who dreamed of an empire and got a velvet bag, and Marco d'Aviano, the Capuchin friar who celebrated Mass in the ruins that night, who gave the soldiers a reason to believe they were fighting for something larger than land or plunder. The Pope would beatify him in 2003, 320 years later. History is full of turning points that people recognize only in hindsight. September 12, 1683, is one of the rare ones where the participants seemed to sense it themselves. Sobieski's letter to the Pope, "We came, we saw, God conquered," has the weight of a man who knows he has just witnessed something that will echo. And it did echo. It echoes still. The coalitions were fragile. The motivations were mixed. Faith, glory, greed, obligation, fear. France, the most powerful Christian kingdom, was allied with the Ottomans. Hungarian Protestants fought alongside the Turks. The Pope was funding a Polish king to save a Habsburg emperor who resented the rescue. History is always messier than the myth. But on that one afternoon, for 30 minutes, it was simple. The cavalry came down the hill, the lines broke, the camp fell, and 3 centuries of momentum reversed. Somewhere in the wreckage of Kara Mustafa's camp, a parrot was flying free over the ruins. Sobieski never did catch it. Maybe that is the right image to end on. Not the glory or the carnage, not the silk cord or the golden standard. A small, bright, uncatchable thing, loose in the smoke, belonging to no one, flying over the wreckage of 2 empires' ambitions. This has been The Gates of Vienna, a 3-part series. Thank you for listening. I am Basil, and this has been a deep dive.